Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This highly practical podcast series explores HR and management hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Brought to you by Actus software, our aim is to build a better workplace for people. The HR Uprising is about collaborating and supporting each other to build the confidence and skills to rise up to each challenge and deliver real, lasting business value. You can find out more at hruprising.com or join our LinkedIn community. Now introducing your host, chartered psychologist, best-selling author, entrepreneur and speaker, Lucinda.
Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week I'm excited because I've got what I would call a proper psychologist. I know I've got a psychology qualification, but this is a practicing psychologist with me this week, Gillian Hyde. And Gillian is the Managing Director and Chief Psychologist of Psychological Consultancy Limited, which is a team of business psychologists who specialise in effective HR solutions. So obviously we're going to be looking at psychology from an HR point of view. And in a moment, I'll get Gillian to introduce herself. But what we wanted to explore was some of the challenges that you can find around personality. I've always found personality very interesting, and Gillian is an expert in a number of tools, but we're going to discuss one in particular, which talks about your dark side. And knowing that we've got lots of listeners out there who have challenging teams to work with, should we just put it that way? We thought it would be quite interesting to explore the different personalities that we might be working with, and to a certain extent, if there are any ways in which we can recognise those challenges and how we can get the best out of those people that we work with if they're displaying their dark side, shall we say. So Gillian, welcome. Would you like to give us a bit of an introduction yourself?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Lucinda, and thank you very much for inviting me onto this podcast. Yes, so as Lucinda said, I am a practicing psychologist. So I have a degree in psychology and then a master's in organizational psychology. So I'm a chartered organizational psychologist. I've been working in the field of assessment since 1989, in fact, and that career has encompassed a number of facets, from actually developing psychometrics, whether it's ability tests and or some personality tools. So in terms of actually creating psychometrics and doing all the research behind that, as well as distributing some world-renowned personality measures, but also, and alongside that, very much a career in the latter stages, I suppose certainly in the last 10 and 15 years, of a lot of actual assessment practice. So delivering in-depth assessments and feedbacks, whether it be for leadership development or high-stakes selection, or perhaps for coaching as well. So actually applying the findings from particularly personality instruments in order to help either an organization make a great decision or to help an individual to develop themselves and to try to create a more positive impact at work. So
we're going to focus in on the dark side, aren't we? The Star Wars factor here, because this is an area that you are expert in, which is the Hogan. What's the whole name of the tool that you're expert in, Gillian?
It's the Hogan Development. It's the Hogan Development Survey.
The Hogan Development Survey.
Yeah.
Yes, and certainly from the psychologists that I've met, this is one that they often refer to, particularly for leaders, and because of this really interesting dark side that it explores. And I figured that, as I said in the introduction, that this might be something quite interesting, because I think if you can explain a little bit about these derailers and how we might recognize them in people, and also maybe what you can do if you are, we can think about how we can manage them in ourselves, but I think particularly if you are an HR professional, let's say maybe in a small organization, and you are aware that a member of that executive team is demonstrating these derailers, whether there's anything we can do to coach them, to support them, to improve them, to hold the mirror up, because that actually could make a critical difference to the effectiveness of that executive team and the effectiveness of that business. That's not to say it doesn't in big companies as well. It does massively in big companies, but I think you often, in a big company, you might be lucky enough to have that self-awareness, as in you might have had that development, and people have sometimes been through sort of more formal development and had that awareness brought to them more so than particularly career entrepreneurs, I think, are often quite guilty of these sort of things. They haven't had those rough edges. rubbed off in a large organisation. So, in terms of taking us through it, before we go into what they are, so can I explore? So, and I suppose maybe this goes back to your comment about selection. I'm taking the assumption that, all of us will have differing amounts of these 11 traits, and some of them we might have a tendency, let's say it's an overdone strength, to demonstrate the dark side of it. If someone came and interview, do you find that with self-awareness people can moderate it, or is that something that is, go back to our willpower thing, that we are likely always to elicit it? What's your view in terms of people being able to change or develop or improve it?
I think people certainly can change and develop and improve it. The key to that is their motivation and how much they want to do it, and if they see a good reason for doing it. So you could have the same person, I suppose, get the same feedback, but at different stages in their life or in different stages in their career might respond to that differently. So the key is to find a reason for that person to want to change. And I mean, if they are leading a team, that ought to be enough reason. If the coach or the HR person can somehow, through various sessions, various awareness sessions, convey to that individual that every time they engage in the more extreme side of this behavior, they erode the trust and loyalty and commitment of the people who work for them. And also to talk about, well, what impact that has, both on all of their colleagues and the business. There is a bottom line implication to all of this as well. There have been lots of studies that look at successful organizations and the profiles of leaders. And isn't it the book Good to Great that shows actually the more humble leaders are the ones, and the ones that will admit to some faults are the ones that actually lead the most successful organizations.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing. It's about, but I'm talking in generalized terms. And obviously, if you had an individual in front of you who you were coaching or giving some development feedback, hopefully you could have some context to that conversation and think about something that person wants to achieve, either for themselves or for their team or for their organization as a whole. And then the trick is to align what it is they're doing in terms of, so how's that going to have a negative impact on them achieving that, and what could they do to manage those behaviors better so that they're more likely to achieve their desired outcome. So and that shouldn't be too difficult, especially if you're within an organization. If you're an internal consultant, you ought to, so what's good about that would be knowing what might be the keys to motivate the individual. What could be, I guess, potentially a problem is just that relationship, is managing that. If you are an employee, say, of that person, if you are working in a small owner managed organization, for instance, and you're an employee and you're giving feedback to the boss, so how do you manage that relationship as an external consultant, which is how I do it? Of course, that's much easier. I don't have any stake in that. I don't have any political stake in it. So that would be something I think that would be very key. So it's not just about, so what do you say and what advice do you give, but it would be about making it very clear what is your position in that process. If you're an internal HR person giving advice to a boss, and it would be very much, you'd need to make sure that right at the beginning, you had covered the ground in terms of the fact that you had no political gain in this process, that any gain actually obviously would be for the organization as a whole. And it's almost like the boss has to give you, the HR person, license to give this feedback. They need to trust you, but they need to trust you as a kind of dispassionate observer.
And I suppose if you've got specific feedback, that's also going to help. If you actually, you sat around a board table and you've seen, maybe let's start talking about some of the derailers and some real examples, perhaps. So you've got one that's bold, perhaps, a person who's the derailer is overly self-confident, arrogant, with inflated feelings of self-worth is the definitely. So I'm thinking that could be a classic, CEO, sales director, banging the table, larger than life, talking over people, that sort of things. And clearly there's positive traits to that. There's confidence and assertiveness and probably get stuff done.
Yes.
But the downside, it is the dark side of a positive, which could have negative impact on others. And I guess if they don't have, going back to your point earlier about the good to great piece, if they have that without that sort of humility / self-awareness, then people won't trust them, they won't like them, and therefore their authority is undermined. And this whole trait of this is about being authoritative, isn't it? So you're almost not achieving what they want to do.
Yes, it's completely counterproductive. Yes, so you talk about the authority and being undermined, and also their credibility being undermined, their reputation being undermined. That's absolutely true.
And I
yes,
guess,
and
would that be quite important to that personality? Or would you say that it's almost the most important thing to them would be undermined?
Yes. So the bold person, I mean, what's interesting is that they will come across as seeming very confident, and yes, they've got that optimism and dynamism and energy and positive can do and all of that. But yes, they get to a point where it's almost like, well, I can do this, and this is the best way because I say it like this, and I had the best idea, and and not kind of recognizing that anybody else has a contribution. So yes, everybody who works with them will just ultimately get fed up with that and not feel remotely motivated. Like the next time they speak in that way, it's like, here they go again and talking about themselves and their idea, and why aren't they building on the ideas that other people have brought, or why aren't they admitting to what's gone wrong? Because also people who have this characteristic, if things go wrong, they find it very hard to hold their hand up and say, yes, I made a mistake. Because
is this Donald Trump? I'm just feeling it's like, okay, you take the credit but don't take the responsibility.
Donald Trump has got obviously a whole swathe
serious dark side.
He's got that combined with a very, very unhealthy dose of paranoia, clearly, in there. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting is that whilst they look like they're sort of coming across as these confident people, the reason they're overdoing it actually is because they're insecure.
Yeah,
they feel that they need to impress, and then they overdo it. And they go too far, and it just turns everybody off. And they maybe not aware of when they're sort of tipping over the edge into that style of counterproductive behavior. So yes, having something where you can hold up the mirror and say, actually, the very things you're trying to achieve here, you're actually achieving the opposite. If you're wanting to impress people, you're actually doing the absolute reverse of that. And of course, with any of these derailers, and particularly in this context with an internal consultant, say, giving feedback, if you're able to do some 360 feedback, that's massively helpful. Because I haven't done it a lot with derailers, but I have done it sometimes. And there's, you always have that sort of top 10 areas to improve piece. What are the things people don't want you to do? What could you do? And they always link to the derailer profile.
Oh, that's interesting.
So then you
don't talk over people. Yeah. So that would give them, that would give you the in, because I was thinking the interesting thing about that particular one, which can probably be one of the more destructive ones I'm looking at, these are sort of more overtly destructive in terms of it's very visible, is that they might also be quite defensive, I imagine, because it is actually covering up insecurity. You'd have to be very careful, because you can almost feel like you've got to attack a personality like that to get them to come in, but actually they're quite vulnerable. That's a sort of self-center, so you've got to be quite careful. So having something like 360 or a tool, some specific evidence, and tapping into what they're trying to achieve is the key.
And also just opening their eyes to comparing themselves to people who are different to them can be really illuminating. Like there's oftentimes with people who are high on bold, they don't see what's wrong with it, because obviously, it will have helped them to get where they are, but it might be what actually stops them from getting any further. But they're still in their mind thinking about all of the positive aspects of it. So sometimes one thing I say to the people who are high on bold is I say, okay, so would you say you're good at your job? And every time I ask this question of a bold person, they always immediately say, yes. And I say, okay, so can you imagine that I have another person in the room who's equally as good as you at their job, but they don't have the same personality as you? I ask them the same question. Their response is, oh, well, most of the time, yeah, I think I do a pretty good job. I try really hard. I tend to, I do try to keep myself up to date, like to know what I'm talking about. Really obviously want to get a good result. Yeah, I think I do a fairly good job. Okay, so can we see the difference? And that's the kind of conversation then you can start to have with somebody who's high on bold and say, look, both of you equally good at the job, but one of you describes yourself in that very definite, no room for error, no room for questioning. Yes, I'm really good at the job. Okay, and the other person, it shows more humility. Shows that maybe on some days they're going to be better than others. We all have good days, we all have bad days. There is some room for error in there. And that the result of that, the impact that you have on other people from those two different standpoints is very different. And stop a moment and consider, what is the different impact those two responses are having? And think about then, the next time you respond in that sort of way to a situation, or you act in that sort of overconfident way in a situation, stop and think about, well, if I had been more questioning, if I had been more, or maybe somebody else has a contribution to make here, or maybe somebody else has got a better idea, inviting more contributions or whatever, the end result you're going to have, the impact you're having on your team or your colleagues or your direct reports, whoever, will be massively different.
That's interesting, because I think I've just recognised an ex-boyfriend that had that trait. And the thing I used to notice about that was the fact that they would say with absolute certainty that black was right, for argument's sake, whereas someone else who absolutely had all the facts and probably knew that black really was white or was yellow, let's say, would go, well, I think I'm about 95% certain. And so it's quite dangerous that you can have somebody who, let's say, is 30% certain, but says it as if they're 100%, whereas the person who's 95% more likely to be right, but is less assertive. So it can be difficult in certain circumstances. It can be risky. Going into some of the others, so we were talking about, that was one of them, bold. Do you want to maybe give us a high level view of a few of the others that come up that you think we might recognise, particularly in, as HR professionals, we might find challenging on a senior leadership team that we might want to work with? I realise probably any of them, but any particular ones? Any particular ones come up time and time again?
Well, there's one that I think can be fairly challenging, and that would be the mischievous one. It's quite complex, but these are the people who are quite restless, quite impulsive, easily.
Is this Boris? No, I'm just doing politics. Could be.
I mean, the thing is, on the upside, they can be very charming. They can be very persuasive and good at influencing and negotiating. And if you're a salesperson, it's probably quite a useful skill to have. But knowing if you've got too much of it would also be useful. So when to kind of cap it, when to put the lid on it. But so they have this air of, that kind of easily bored, restless, always looking for some excitement. What else is happening? What else should I be doing? Should I be trying this out? Should I be doing that? And also, though, they have this notion that the kind of normal rules don't apply to them. They're kind of above all of that. They don't need to bother with that. And they also like taking, or are comfortable, I should say, taking risks or testing limits that other people find very uncomfortable. Now, that could just be something like, so that again, I'm going to use a salesperson example, because it can actually be really useful if you're making a business, but if you're making a sales pitch, to say, we can have that ready next week, when it's going to be almost impossible and people are going to have to work all night in order to get it ready. But if it gets you that sale, then that's a good result. But so the person who's high on mischievous is prepared to take that risk to say that. They might also be prepared to take the risk of going into a presentation with no preparation whatsoever, because they feel that they can rely on their charm. Now, that might work maybe half the time, or even 70% of the time, but quite a bit of the time it's not going to work. And if they are presenting with somebody else, or if they're representing the business as a whole, people are going to get really fed up with that and annoyed and irritated by it, because they'll feel let down, because this person just didn't prepare. They just winged it and thought they'd be able to persuade and influence and charm their way out of it when they just couldn't. And the other thing with this scale. It is quite complex, but there is a sort of element of deceit with this one. So these are the people who will tell a few white lies or embellish a story to get what they want. I mean, they do have an agenda.
So they might say one thing to
behavior.
one set of people and one thing to another set of people. So it could affect trust. You'd be seen to be a little bit changeable, or in terms of the messaging. And so at a senior level, if you haven't reined that in, then it's going to, I can see it has its place in sales, but it's going to affect trust in that position, isn't it? And they almost think that they change their mind based on who they're talking to. That sort of inconsistent. Definitely, I think this is Boris. I'm sorry, but I mean, I don't know if we can find a politician for each one, but we're doing well so far.
I know. I should have a rogues gallery.
Absolutely,
that's true. Actually, yeah.
Although saying that, so then the other one that is which is of a pattern. We've got bold, mischievous, and then colourful. I can imagine this is quite an interesting one. So this one is someone who's quite dramatic. They're attention seeking. They interrupt, quite interruptive. Probably got guilty of this myself, and poor listening skills. So they could be quite fun, I guess, but gosh, I mean, I can think those three all on a board together. No one to get a word in edgeways, right?
The colourful people, I mean, they love being the centre of attention. So they will do anything and everything to draw attention to themselves. So that could be just theatrical gestures. It could be talking a lot. It could even be in the way that they dress, the way that they present themselves. They just, enjoy that. But the trouble is when they do too much of it, there's a kind of neediness almost then for that being in the spotlight. And it becomes more about them, and they're feeding off you, the audience. That's giving them energy. They're enjoying their performance instead of thinking, what do you actually need to hear? And should I be actually asking you a question and asking you to join in and contribute to the discussion? But yes, you're right. These people will have had a lot of positive feedback for this style of behavior because they're the kinds of people who are described as the life and soul of the party.
Yeah.
Other people will rely on them to have something to say. For people who are quieter and find social situations or meetings more challenging because they're more socially anxious, then they will rely on these people. And
so we must reinforce those behaviours actually for them, because others complain about it, but also lean on them. Do you find that some come together more often? I can imagine that bold and colourful could come together quite often in one person. Or do some link together more often than others?
There are a total of 11 scales across the instrument, and there are 3 main clusters. So when you look at a profile, you tend to look to see, has this person got high scores in just one of the clusters rather more than spread around? And that does happen sometimes. So the 3 that we've talked about so far are all on one cluster. So bold, colourful and mischievous, plus one other called imaginative, are all on a cluster called moving against. And so just briefly to mention imaginative, these are the people who have loads of ideas. So it can be a great resource for problem solving, but they just get so excited about every single idea they have. And a lot of those ideas could be massively impractical. So they can end up confusing people. And they also quite like being a bit different and drawing attention to themselves through saying something maybe just that's a bit out there, maybe a bit inappropriate. So they can do that. They like playing practical jokes. Anyway, so imaginative with colourful, bold and mischievous form this what's called moving against cluster. And occasionally you will get people who've got high scores on all 4. So that's a really strong kind of influencing, persuading, almost seducing kind of a cluster.
When you say moving against, what does it mean by moving against what?
Moving as people. So you're moving against them. So you're not frightened of them. You're not running away from them. You're moving against them as a way of managing your insecurities.
Okay,
you're
pushing.
Trying to.
So it's not moving away from.
Manipulate them.
Yeah, it's pushing them. We're both gesturing on Zoom, aren't we? Pushing our hands out. Right. Yeah.
You're trying to bring them round to your way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're acting upon them to try to bring them around to it's agree with you. It's not a pull.
It's a push approach of influencing.
Yes. Yeah. Whereas the first 4 scales, which we haven't mentioned yet actually, are what we call the moving away cluster. So this is about these scales are much more related to feelings of sort of self-criticism, self-doubt, lack of trust in others, preferring to be alone. Sorry, it's 5 scales here, and being very socially anxious, socially self-conscious. And so people manage that sort of bunch of insecurities through withdrawing from others, whether mentally or physically.
And sorry, when you say the scales, can I just say, because I would not, so is it pushing against and pull, what are the 5 scales? Are they things you just went through? Do you want to go through them again, just so we understand what the scales are?
Yeah, no, I didn't say what they were, because with there being so many, I wasn't sure. I had described the 4 scales of moving against, but there are 5 scales of moving away. So they are excitable, which is about being pretty volatile in mood, easily disappointed in people. So you're very up and down in terms of how you feel about. So if a little thing goes wrong with a relationship or a project, then you sort of feel like, feel like the whole thing is tainted. You don't want to have anything more to do with that.
So they're quite volatile. They might blow up because they're quite volatile. You might be a bit.
Yes.
You walk on. Talk about people. You walk on eggshells.
Yeah, they could. Yes. So you just don't know who you're dealing with from one day to the next. Are they going to smile and be welcoming, or are they going to just frown and scowl at you and think they don't want anything to do with it? Yep. Then they're skeptical, and these are the people who are overly mistrustful and suspicious when they just don't need to be. Positives about that are obviously about being cynical and astute and shrewd, but when they overstate it, they just don't trust anybody's intentions. They're always questioning, always thinking, why is this person doing this? What are they trying to do? And just seeing the potential negative in that. The next one is cautious. These are the people who are really easily embarrassed and very socially self-conscious. And so unless they're an expert on something and they're in their comfort zone, they're unlikely to make a contribution in a meeting, say, because they feel that somebody might point the finger at them and say, that's really stupid, and laugh at them. And they would feel mortified if that happened.
So they would be, if they were on a board, I don't think they'd be that likely to be on a board unless they were there in a technical specialism, personality-wise. They might say, they might be representing engineering
or because they owned the business,
yes.
or something like that. Yes. It's not a natural progression.
Right. Yeah.
And it isn't something that those people feel naturally comfortable with. Unless they feel, as you say, very knowledgeable about something and that their expertise gives them that status. But it would mean there'd be certain things they would contribute to and others where they might just switch off and not say anything because they don't feel that they can have the knowledge or the expertise to do so. And then the next one, the 4th one, is reserved. So these are the people who are very self-sufficient, very happy working on their own, don't need input from others, but nor do they recognize that others necessarily need advice from them and input from them. So they can actually, physically withdraw from people and are hard to reach in that way because they don't recognize the need for that interaction or support that other people around them, that their colleagues might need. And then the last one is called leisurely. And it's really about being passive aggressive. So these are the people who can, if you interrupt them and say, oh, could you just do this for me? They might smile at you and say, yeah, sure. You walk out the room and they just put it to one side and don't bother doing it. And you don't realize that once you've worked with this person for a few weeks, you'll see it as being a fairly, consistent style of behavior. But these people are quite complex because they can be very nice, and in their normal personality, they may well be very interpersonally sensitive. So then when they get feedback on this, because this derailer actually in the end is anti the team, because you're not subjugating yourself to what the team needs. You're saying, I've decided what's important for me. I'm going to focus on that, and nothing's going to stop me from doing that or interrupt that.
I put money on the fact my husband's got this. It's an overdone stroke. Absolutely impossible to motivate unless they want to do it. But they're nice. They're nice to your face. As you think that, but then you realise nothing happens. Really hard in change. This sort of person, because they look like they're going with it, and then nothing happens. It's a bit like this, that the idea is not, people perceive it as if the idea not their idea, they're not going to go with it type thing, or that might be slightly different.
It's not necessarily that. No, it's more that they want to decide what they should be working on.
Yeah.
They want to create their own agenda.
So it's very
They
autonomous.
want to decide what's important, because it's almost as if that sort of keeps them safe. Mm-hmm. You know, one hypothesis about how this develops is somebody who maybe through their socialization process, through their childhood development even, was alternately spoiled and indulged and then ignored. So they kind of go from that high to low. It's like, oh, I'm really important, people love me, to no, they're not interested. So if they can create their own agenda of what they think is important, then it's like they cling on to that, because that carries on. They can keep feeling important. So that's the moving away, and we've done moving against. And then the last, there's 2 scales on what's called moving towards, and that's all about conformity and compliance. One of those is about having overly perfectionistic tendencies. So, but the downside to that is being fussy and critical, maybe not delegating work, which can be very demotivating. And then the last one is dutiful, which is about appeasement really, and acquiescence, and being very conflict averse. So that can be very difficult for somebody who needs to represent the views of others upwards, because they feel very uncomfortable disagreeing with their boss.
Quite status conscious. And I was thinking the one that you said before, the diligent one, which is they're quite precise, and they tend to maybe micromanage. I think that's an interesting one in this. So people who have these traits in this virtual world that we're in, and I think bear in mind that all of these that we've described, that enough of it is a good thing, right? They're just personality traits that we might recognize. It only becomes a problem, isn't it, when you become overdone and that you're exhibiting the dark part of it. Is that correct, Gillian?
Yes, that's right, which is why when somebody takes the assessment, we're only interested in very high scores.
Fine. Yeah. So otherwise, so someone who's got an eye for detail, that can be good. It's just too much of it that, say, in a virtual environment, they might not feel able to let go. So I'm thinking there are lots of examples that I'm hearing from people when I'm doing webinars of managers who are just absolutely micromanaging and sort of enforcing presenteeism, which really isn't going to be very effective in this virtual world. And again, another thing where it affects trust. Trust is really particularly important, I think, at the moment, because of people having to work out of sight. And so that's having a high level there that could almost be more concerning, because I don't know whether they're more anxious in this sort of environment potentially. So there's lots of these can. So in terms of your working with people, so there's the 3 clusters we talked about. So you've got your pushing away we talked about, which is this sort of very influential. You've got the ones which are more sort of a pull. What did you call it in terms of the cluster, the top cluster with excitable and skeptical?
Okay, so they're the moving away ones.
They're the moving away.
Yeah.
And the ones moving towards. It sounds a bit counterintuitive to me, the cluster names.
No, I know it is. So the moving away ones are all about the ones who are sort of more self-critical, self-doubting, manage their feelings of insecurity by withdrawing from others, either physically or mentally. And in fact, I mean, which can be quite intimidating as well. So there is that sort of almost pushing people. There can be pushing people away through being, just kind of too volatile and cross and irritated. Or there's the actually physically withdrawing and moving yourself away because you just would rather be on your own. So they're all in that cluster. Then there's the moving against. Now these are the people who manipulate, seduce, influence, persuade, charm others with either their ideas or the things they say or their confidence or their risk-taking. And they very much act upon people, I suppose, would be
I'd call that moving towards, but that's my terminology. They're both kind of, away and against, that's different. So it's against the pushing.
So, yeah. And then moving towards is complying, conforming. You're moving towards what other people want or what you think they want.
Okay. Yes. Needing others. So so you obviously, if you're analysing personality, you'd look at them in clusters. And I guess if there's people with if you've got overdone strengths or the dark side in a specific cluster, would that bring more warning bells than otherwise? Or how many, in an average person, how many traits would you expect to experience the dark side of?
Okay, so a lot of people have 1, 2, or 3 high scores. As you get, 6, 7, anything 6 and above is pretty unusual. 4 and 5 is kind of teetering on that. There's quite a lot going on here kind of feeling.
Got you. Okay, so it'd be perfectly normal if, as we've talked about these things, if we recognised one or other in us, and we probably have had feedback around it, or maybe self-aware of it, and going back to how we started this conversation, maybe we managed to keep it in check at work, but you know, when we let our hair down at home, we talk over people and don't listen, or whatever that one, you know, we might display it, which is probably okay. Is there a case that people show it more in stress, or any other circumstances that might bring it out more?
Yes, so there, we talk about these characteristics are, it's like lifting the lid off, isn't it? So when are we more likely to display them? And it is, at times of stress or pressure, when we're not able to manage our social impression as well as usual, whether we're distracted, if we're tired, if we're unwell, all of those things. You just don't even have the kind of energy, the resources left to be able to manage your social impression as well as usual. So these kinds of characteristics will be displayed more. But when you say, actually, interestingly, this is slightly off topic really, but you said, you know, talk about maybe people keep it under wraps at work and then at home it comes out, but maybe that's okay. But obviously from a relationship, in a personal relationship point of view, knowing about your derailers, it can be massively useful. I mean, I'm not into relationship counseling myself at all, but obviously I know what mine are and I know what my husband's are. And there's certainly plenty of people here at work who similarly know theirs and know their partners. And it is really useful because, you know, oh yeah, so that's why they do that. So
give that allowance.
It can be very useful.
Definitely. I mean, it's leisurely's make. I've got that one. I'm going to notice that one on my husband. I personally find these really, really interesting, as I say. But I mean, I find all personality tools really quite interesting. In terms of how you might use Hogan relative to any others, are there any particulars as we wrap up? Is there any particular places where you'd say that it's a really particularly useful tool for people to consider?
I think very much in the leadership development or executive coaching space, but also team development. You know, if you've got a team that just isn't gelling, it isn't working very well together, sometimes it needs to be a bit more introspective and to have a look at, well, what is that? And often with teams, you think about values. And values is very important as well. And because if you've got a clash with values, you can feel very threatened and uncomfortable with people who've got values in opposition to you. But you do need some diversity there as well. And but with derailers, I think you can, because they have this capacity to really irritate each other. We all have this massive capacity to irritate each other through the manifestation of our derailers. If we can get a grip on that in a team, and if there's a way in which, and certainly we've worked with teams who were prepared to do this, to share that information. So in fact, what you typically would do is we would give individuals feedback prior to the team event. And we wouldn't just use the Hogan Development Survey, we would look at their bright side and their values as well, probably, and give them feedback in the round. But to the individuals, and I have to actually ask those individuals permission to share their profiles. And then you can do lots of nice graphs and things like that, and exercises on a team development workshop, and it's just very liberating. So people start to understand each other much more, rather than just what's the word? Something, you know, like being at loggerheads, clashing all the time. It's a way through.
So it's a really quite I mean, obviously it's not the same as some, and I will do other episodes on other personality tools, because there are lots of other personalities and tools and psychometrics out there. I've always thought this is a particularly interesting one, but it is one I think you have to have someone, a psychologist, whereas, you know, you can have other tools that team development tools that anyone can go and get trained up on, which is quite easy to run, I don't know, DISC or sort of personality tools that lots of people would be accredited in. It's a much more thorough approach to personality, isn't it? Quite personalized than some of the others.
I would say so. I think and more sensitive, and needs to be handled delicately.
Exactly. It's not saying you're a yellow, that's fine. It's going. It's actually
definitely not. There's a lot more hard work has to go into a feedback or an interpretation or a practical application of the information that you get from the Hogan Development Survey. And one thing that I should say, and should have said before actually, is we never use it in isolation. We would always use it alongside a Brightside personality instrument. We tend to use the Hogan Personality Inventory, but we have plenty of clients who use it alongside the NEO or the WAVE or the OPQ. You need that balance. You shouldn't, I wouldn't advise looking at a dark side profile on its own in isolation. You could have two people with the same derailers profile, but their bright side profile might be quite different. And then, and that gives it a different interpretation. We've talked about the colourful derailer. So these are the people who love being in the limelight, who love talking a lot, they're quite exhibitionistic and all of that. But you can have somebody who's extroverted on their bright side personality profile, who's colourful, but you can have somebody who's introverted, who's colourful. That does happen. So with the extrovert colourful, then that colourful is just kind of like an extension of their bright side personality profile, and probably will see it a lot, not just under stress. But for the introverted colourful, then that has you have a whole different conversation then about that, about saying, well, okay, so when is it that you tip over into this more attention-seeking, more talkative side? Are there particular situations or particular triggers? And you might have I've had people who say, for instance, they're into amateur dramatics, or they love giving presentations, but they don't like going to parties. So they have that mix of being introverted, but in certain situations,
Eric
really
Morecambe
loving.
kind of thing. These Billy Connolly, these kind of personalities, these stand-up comedians that are very shy actually behind the scenes, but then flamboyant.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And so you can see how your interpretation then of that colourful derailer needs to be modified according to how introverted or extroverted they are.
Fascinating. Brilliant. Gillian, thank you so much. I thought that was really interesting. We will obviously put all your details in the show notes, and how people can get hold of you in terms of, and your LinkedIn and Twitter, etc., in terms of www.psychological-consultancy.com. Is there any other way you'd like people to connect with you? Are you on social media personally?
On Twitter.
On Twitter? You can let me have any of those, and I'll put them in the show notes if people want to connect with you.
LinkedIn and Twitter would be the two.
Brilliant. Great, thanks so much for joining us on the HR Uprising. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, Lucinda.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising, proudly brought to you by Actus Software, the joined-up performance and talent management solution. You can access links to any of the information or resources mentioned in the show via the podcast page at www.hruprising.com. If you like what we do, please subscribe, tell your colleagues, and leave a review. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising.